Hi everyone, Lior is here with another Jumpstart Lightning episode. Today we are continuing our ArcBox nuts and bolts video series. I have Matt with me today to talk to me about everything that is the mechanics of ArcBox and the automation around it. Stay tuned. Hi everyone, Lior is here, and today we are continuing our ArcBox nuts and bolts video series. I'm excited to have a member of the Jumpstart team, Matt. Matt, how's it going? Why won't you introduce yourself? Who you are and what is it that you do?
Sure. Very nice to be here. So thank you for having me. Matthew Garrett. I'm a cloud solution architect. So I work with some of our strategic customers in Azure, helping them consume and architect some of their solutions that they're bringing to market inside Azure Cloud.
And Matt, you're part of the Jumpstart team for a few months now, and you've been involved in many of the things that we are doing internally to build all the awesomeness that we're trying to provide the community, our customers, our partners, our own field. And you've been heavily involved in that. Just before we're getting into the weeds, how are you enjoying the experience thus far?
Good. Moonlighting on the Arc Jumpstart team is great. The pay is not, but hey, we're working on that one thing at a time.
Right, right. Definitely, the pay is not awesome. We're working on that, and we're trying to get you your own budget for that. And so, Matt, the reason that I want you to be part of this is the entire team coming and doing this RBox nuts and bolts video series. The reason that I want to bring you into this episode is because you've been heavily involved in the architecture and the implementation around a lot of the automation concepts that we have in RBox. So, do you mind maybe share with the audience some of those concepts and where do you actually get going with this? Like, how do you get started?
Absolutely. Yep. I have a couple of assistive screens, so let's take a look and see where we get started. So with ArcBox, especially as ArcBox 2.0 was launched, it was really important for us on the team to make sure that there was a way to get started for everyone. And initially, having ARM scripts is great and using the portal is amazing, but there are certain folks that want to move forward and use some of the newer technologies available. Bicep is one of those, which is an amazing kind of evolution of the ARM templating
Mhm.
language. And then you also have a lot of not only internal customers, but external customers and partners that are very familiar with HashiCorp Terraform. So we wanted to provide all of these as a mechanism so anybody could get started very easily with very little learning curve. That's kind
Mhm.
of the key, is enabling as many people to get started and hands-on with ArcBox as possible. So you can pick your poison, so to speak, whether it's ARM, Bicep, or Terraform.
Right.
Any of these you choose, it's really easy to get up and running and deploy Jumpstart ArcBox.
And so, Matt, as part of RBox, like this deployment is pretty complex in terms of developing this. But the reason that it's somewhat complex is because we want to provide this awesome user experience. So it will be seamless. So it will be just fun to deploy and fun to start exploring Azure Arc. But what are the elements that people need to know about as we are developing this? Like, it will be nice to share with them some of those concepts that are going behind the scenes.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm one of those people, as are many, where you see things happen or you just kind of trust the process. But it's also kind of nice to know what's happening behind the curtain sometimes. So there is a lot of PowerShell that's in use here. PowerShell is very powerful scripting language that we can actually use to do a lot of this automation
Mhm.
process. And so some of the things that are actually happening once you deploy the template, whether you're using ARM, Bicep, Terraform, doesn't matter. After the Azure artifacts are actually created, there's a process that happens on what we call the client VM. And so the first thing that we go do is we what we call Bootstrap. And so Bootstrap is really prepping this client VM to get ready for all of the subsequent processes that are going to happen to
Mhm.
bring this ArcBox environment to life. So in the bootstrapping process, and we'll take a look at this in a little bit live, we go through and we set environment variables. We have several packages that we need to install that are
Mhm.
dependencies for the next steps that are going to happen down the line. Several artifacts actually get downloaded from the GitHub repo, and we have customization tasks that will then launch after this VM restarts and start making it the flavor that you chose.
And Bootstrap, Matt, is part of the custom script extension, right? That's the first script that we are actually injecting into the client VM, right?
Yeah, you bet. We actually use the custom script extension for several of the pieces, especially if you're deploying data services or the DevOps flavor. But yes, that's the first thing that happens once that VM is created. It gets the script injected into it as part of the template process.
So what happens after the bootstrap?
After the bootstrap, this is where you as an end user will actually connect to that client VM through RDP or through Bastion, depending on how you, what level of security you've chosen to deploy ArcBox. And
Hmm.
at that point, a couple of scripts will pop up and you watch them go by. And a lot of people just either leave and make a cup of coffee or just let it happen. But just to let you know what's actually happening during that process is this is where the actual script based on the flavor, whether it's IT Pro, data services, or the new DevOps flavor, and that will actually start getting the motion going for all the pieces that need to make that solution up. In some cases, when we're talking about servers, this is where we're actually going to download VHDXs and start putting those into Hyper-V. There's a lot of times where we're going to need several artifacts, especially in the GitOps
Hmm.
flow, where you're going to have to go through and do some hands-on pieces, and having those preloaded onto the desktop are important. Data services, getting the Kubernetes clusters up and running and ready to accept customization or GitOps flows, onboarding resources on your behalf so that they're available in the ArcBlade inside the Azure portal, and making the desktop nice and customized so it looks
Hmm.
and feels like the ArcBox project, and all of the icons are right where you need them so you don't have to go hunting.
And I like how you able to summarize everything that we have that you're going to show me here in a second. I'm sure everything that we have in the customization to just 6 bullets. It's kind of funny to see because obviously you and I know what's going on behind the scene. But let's share with the audience a bit about how does that look from a code perspective? Like what are the things that are actually happening there?
Sure thing. So let me actually pull up VS Code here. So here I've got a couple of the key points that we were talking about in the previous slide. So starting
Mhm.
off with the Bootstrap script, this is what's actually getting launched during that template deployment process. So a couple of key things. I'm not going to go through this line by line because we're not doing a coding school here, but just to kind of give you an idea of what's happening.
Yeah.
First and foremost, we're setting a bunch of environment variables. The reason we've chosen to do it this way is because all of these subsequent scripts and all of these processes, and maybe even some of the interactions you as a user will have, rely on some of this information being available on the client VM. So rather than put it in a text file and try and read it in later or thinking about databases, it's just easier to leverage the system environment variables and have these ready to go,
Mhm.
and we can share that with other PowerShell processes down the road.
And this is really part of the bigger motion or bigger notion, sorry, that is the user experience is the number one priority for us, right? I mean, like we don't
Absolutely.
want you to think about all these nifty crifty stuff that people tend to forget. So I'm happy that you brought that up.
Thank you. Next piece is, again, just highlighting a couple of key ones. We have a huge amount of things that require things such as the Azure CLI, the Azure PowerShell SDK, kubectl. So we use Chocolatey, which is a really nice application packaging platform for Windows. And there's also Brew, which is counterpart for Macintosh, if you've
Mhm.
ever used that. But essentially, we're able to grab these packages and very quickly deploy them without going through a bunch of MSI install scripts or anything like that. These are already packaged up and ready to go. Just provided a list of the ones we need. Bing, bang, boom. They're loaded onto the desktop.
Mhm. Okay.
After that, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I wanted to see what's next.
Yeah, thank you. What's next is now's the part where we're actually going to go to the GitHub repo. Rather than just carte blanche, download everything, it's a lot nicer to make this, again, more customized and more tailored to the experience that you're looking for. And so what we do is based on the flavor that you've chosen, we're actually going to go to that GitHub repo and we're going to pull several artifacts and we're going to put them in very convenient directories so that either it's well organized if after the automation you want to go and look and see what was done and where everything was created, or again in the cases of something like DevOps where
Mhm.
you actually need to go find that file in that folder to perform some of those hands-on operations. We're doing that for you, and we're kind of putting everything in its place to make sure that those files are nice and organized when and where you need them.
Mhm. And I see that you have the flavor there, and maybe just to share with the audience, few months back when we decided to develop RBox 2.0, the big thing about RBox 2.0 was the flavors and the modular approach. So this is what we're seeing right here.
Absolutely. Yeah. And of course, this is very, as you said, modular. So as more flavors come down the road, it's very easy to inject them into this exact same workflow and extend ArcBox to more and more solution areas.
Cool.
The last thing that we do in here is where we set a scheduled task. So after this Bootstrap script is run, a scheduled task to kind of do the final customization for the flavor that you've chosen is set, and this VM is restarted. So by the time you use an end user, your template automation is complete.
Mm-hmm.
Your next step is to RDP into this client VM or Bastion or whatever the mechanism is. And now these are the scripts that you're going to watch deploy your target solution of IT Pro, data services, or DevOps.
And these are the Logan scripts that you have there open, right? These are the ones that we're actually calling in this schedule task, right?
Yeah, and I was actually going to go through just a few of them briefly, if that's all right by you.
Of course.
Okay. So let's just skim through these. So in an IT pros type of deployment, what we're really looking for is we're looking at Arc-enabled servers. So this is what I was talking about during the presentation, where we're configuring things like Hyper-V. We're making sure it's able to have a virtual
Mhm.
switch, that it has IP addresses available to it. We're actually going to go through and download some virtual machines that have been pre-configured. And those are going to get installed using nested virtualization inside Hyper-V. So we do that here. We use AZ copy.
Mhm.
After we do that, we go create all of the virtual machines inside Hyper-V, get them start up, make sure we block IMDS so that it kind of looks and feels from an Azure perspective like you're using something that isn't in Azure. And that's the whole part of the experience.
Right.
Yep. After we do that, we're going to go through and we're going to inject some of these scripts that onboard those servers as Arc-enabled servers, again, on your behalf, so that we make sure that we're bringing those into the Azure control plane. So now, once you're done deploying the IT Pros flavor, you really have a playground, so to speak, of all the Arc goodies, whether it's just talking about a Windows server, a Linux
Mhm.
server, or even SQL server.
And Matt, I can't help thinking how much we were able to take a lot of layers of automation, right? Because again, just talking to you for this past few minutes, we have the Bootstrap, and then we have the schedule task, which initiate the logon script, and then you have those Azure Arc-enabled servers onboarding scripts that are getting injected into the Hyper-V machine, and all of those things are really masked from the user. This is what we like to call the sausage making, and to bring that into such an elegant solution, which makes you be like, okay, I mean, I don't have to deal with all this stuff. This is just being done for me. So I really like that, honestly,
Yeah.
about ArcBox.
Yeah, me too. In fact, I think one of the highlights of that, and probably the most complicated flavor that we have, is data services. Data services involves so many different areas, but really standing up something that is meant to be a Kubernetes cluster that is not a part of Azure, meaning we can't just use AKS, right? It's kind of cheating. We want to build something that's representative of something that a user would actually use. And so we have two different deployments that we use here. We use CAPI, which is Cluster API, to actually go through, and what that does is it creates virtual machines and deploys Kubernetes on them. So again, more akin to what you would see actually on premises in one of your data centers.
Yep.
And we also have Rancher K3S cluster. So again, that is also a viable solution for some customers that are doing a very simple deployment, or maybe a development deployment, or even you really, in theory, could scale that up to be a production deployment if you wanted to.
And this is really the versatility that we've been, that we've been talking about. So Matt, really, before, and I do have a question around identity that is coming and popping. But now that we're launching RBox for DevOps, that's the new flavor. Can you walk me a bit on the things that we have in DevOps, and what are the things that we're actually doing there?
Yes, this is one of my favorite flavors for obvious reasons, but just to talk through it. So in the DevOps flavor, we really wanted to give our users kind of that experience that they are a DevOps engineer, and what does a day in a life really look like, and what are some of the problems that you can solve with Arc and DevOps, and of course GitOps are a part of this as well. So in this DevOps flavor, we're using those Kubernetes clusters similarly that we were using in the data services. So we are using CAPI and we're using the Rancher K3S. The idea here is we want to kind of simulate multiple Kubernetes clusters, but more so than that, we can have a very robust application with open service mesh and a lot of complexity running in the CAPI cluster, and then using the K3s, the Rancher cluster, you as a user of ArcBox, the DevOps flavor, can actually go through and deploy a lot of this and kind of really see, feel, and touch that experience that Arc
Mhm.
brings to DevOps.
And one concept to wrap this up in the sense of the DevOps flavor before I'm going into the identity stuff, um, because it is a nuts and bolts video series, and one of the things that is very nuts and bolts, you know, just kind of my perspective on this is with the Rancher K3s and the cluster API deployment, and the fact that we're meshing just kind of a Linux space into a Windows space, which is like driven by PowerShell, and the client machine, which is Windows based, and just meshing those together into a unified experience. It's not something that, and you and Matt, you've been doing a lot of automations in your career. It's not something that you see a lot in the wild, right? This is not a regular concept that we're talking about right here, right?
Yeah, you bring up a good point. You usually run into shops that are one or the other, but especially as we kind of come into not only working at Microsoft, but the world we live in now, you have situations where these have to coexist. And bringing a real world example to all of the ArcBox users to be able to see and touch that this really does work and it does exist, I think is very powerful.
And obviously there's the session I did with Dale around everything that is coming with the DevOps flavor. So thank you for walking me through the pieces of the automation there. And obviously there is a lot to unfold here. There's tons of stuff going on. But there's one thing, Matt, and just kind of maybe to wrap this episode, and talk about this specific concept. A lot of the questions that we're getting around why do you need the service principle, and so I really wanted to bring you to maybe explain in your own words, uh, why do we need the service principle.
So it's almost like you saw my slides ahead of time, but that is a wonderful question. And it's something we get asked a lot because realistically, there are a lot of different ways to deploy many of the resources we have in ArcBox. There are managed identities. There's different options that maybe are great choices depending on what stage of your deployment you're in. But the reality of the situation for ArcBox is, and I think we've laid a good foundation here, is it is incredibly complicated. There are a lot of moving pieces, and the value is that we, as the ArcBox, the Jumpstart team, we're abstracting that away. And in order to effectively do that, it's easy to centralize on one mechanism of authorization and authentication, because now in prepping this environment and getting ready to run the deployment, you as a user don't have to know all these different credentials. You just have one. You deploy a service principal, you give it the permissions that you need, and you're done end to end, soup to nuts. And so some of the things that this service principal is doing is it is what is onboarding the Azure Arc enabled resources. It's what's deploying the artifacts on behalf of you as a user. So once we're past the ARM template or bicep, you're not in user land anymore. We're not running it as you, the user's credentials.
Right.
We now have to take those customization scripts, and they need some way to authenticate and deploy these resources into Azure. The service principal is what allows us to do that, also including things that we're doing on the Azure CLI or PowerShell SDK, creating key vaults, creating VMs, setting settings, adding permissions. And then,
Mhm.
of course, one of the critical workloads, which is the CAPI cluster creation, because once we're actually launching that CAPI creation script, which is yet another thing that is happening off to the side, that needs credentials to create all of the pieces that are involved in CAPI, which is a lot of stuff, to be
Yeah.
honest. You've got virtual networks, network security groups, VMs, so on and so forth. So really, the service principle is the heart and soul of all of that, making the automation as easy as possible.
And again, you did it again. You took a very, I want to say, complex concept and implementation and break it down into four line items or four bullets that we're seeing right here. Obviously, there's a lot of things. While you're talking, I'm thinking about all the mechanisms that we have in place that are either touching the service principle or will need the service principle in the user. So again, we just wanted to provide that clarity, right? We just wanted to make sure that people understand that if we are here to talk about the nuts and bolts of our box, to give them the explanation of why the service principle. So I think you did a good job
Thank
laying
you.
down the foundation here. So Matt, before I'm wrapping things up, I just want to first of all, for the audience that want to reach out to you, how do they do that?
I like to creep around on social media, but hopefully in my name tag here, there's my Twitter handle, which is at DCMattyG. So I've had that for many years through my career. So you can reach out to me there. You can probably reach out to me through my Microsoft email address, which is matthew.garrett@microsoft.com, or you can hit up Lior and he'll find me because he knows where I live.
That is true. And for the Jumpstart audience, thank you so much for joining to this another episode of Jumpstart Lightning as part of the ArcBox nuts and bolts video series. Matt, I want to say thank you so much for coming to this episode. Thank you for being such a good sport and a great team member in the Jumpstart and developing a lot of these cool stuff that you are coming up with. And with that, we're just going to say thank you for our viewers. Make sure that you're liking and subscribing to the channel so you will get notified where we are coming up with new videos in as part of this series, and generally speaking, all the cool stuff that we're coming up with as part of the Jumpstart product. So again, Matt, thank you so much, and we will see you next time. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.